Hi everyone, here is another lecture on industrialization, and let me get my watch started. Ben, it's not when the it's just when I start talking. Industrialization, there are some smokestacks in the background from an 1800 Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania steel mill. Some of you have already had this information in class, so you can kind of fast forward through this part. But for first and second period, in 1860, first and sixth period, sorry, the U.S. produced about $2 billion worth of industrial goods. How much had that increased by 1900? So your guess might be, that we've gone up 10%. That's not that much. Maybe we doubled to 4 billion. Maybe we went up by 50% increase to 3 billion. So go ahead and jot down your guess. What would be a reasonable increase for an era when we really increased our industrial output? So the actual number is 11.4 billion, which is about 5 times bigger, a little more than 5 times. So this is when the U.S. really becomes a heavyweight on the world economy, and we go from kind of a medium-sized economy, not even close to the top tier, to eventually second to Britain and then passing Britain as the largest economy. So if you can think for a little bit about what that means to industrialize. What does a society look like before industrialization? Pre-industrial, most people work as what? What are they doing? Go ahead and take a moment to jot down your guess. And they live where? So the answers would be they work obviously in farming. Pre-industrial society, almost everybody's a farmer, maybe 90% or so of the society, and they live in rural areas or at most small towns. Most things are made how? That's right, by hand. Production is slow, and productivity is low. Travel and communication. It's hard. Takes a long time. Things travel slowly. When a country industrializes, what changes? This is a picture much later. You can see the automobile and the horses in the photograph, and there's a trolley car off to the left, and you can see the train tracks. This is actually Los Angeles in 1910. It has grown up to be a much different town. But when a country is industrialized, not everybody works in the cities, but a large percentage of the people do. And by 1900, probably 30 to 40% of the people lived in urban areas, which is just a huge shift. But again, this is not 8th grade. We know that it's not everybody. And they work in industrial production. Production is split between things that are still made by hand and things that are made by machine. And the proportion is increasingly machine made. But again, not everything. Country becomes better connected, travel and communication are fast, and you have more of a national economy and not kind of separate regional or local economies. What are the things you need for industrialization to occur? Go ahead and take a few minutes to jot down your guesses. What would be the elements of supply and demand that are needed for industrialization to happen? You might want to pause the video, because I'm going to, when you turn in your notes, I'm going to look to see if you did your own guessing, unless we already did it in class. So the first one is technological change. The second one is you need more demand, you need bigger markets. Third one is resources. Fourth is labor. The fifth is agricultural productivity. The sixth is capital. The seventh is organization. How many of those did you get? If you take a moment to stop and think about it, it'll help block in your mind the 7. I'm going to spend the rest of the lecture talking about each one of these things, at least briefly. technological change. In the background is a illustration of what? What would you guess that is? That's actually making steel. That is an early version of Henry Bessemer's steel processing technology. So, connection. Just like in the earlier part of the century, when the steamboat and better roads, turnpikes and things helped connect the eastern parts of the country and the Midwest, transportation and communication technologies were big in connecting the U.S. into one national economy. The things here would be the telegraph, the telephone, electrical power, and as well as advancements in railroads and other ways of getting around, steamships. We talked in, second period about the craziness of the instantaneous communication with the telegraph and how that would have felt like they had stepped into the future when they could talk to somebody halfway across a country in a matter of seconds. There are also changes in production technologies, both extraction, mining technologies, and oil drilling, how to get stuff out of the ground, and production. This was, as I said in class earlier in the week, a period of heavy industry, steel, oil, mining, and making big, heavy industrial things, and how to make those things, like how to take iron and melt it down and mix it with other metals to make a stronger, more flexible material called steel, was actually pretty advanced science and chemistry, and that is needed before the heavy industrial revolution can take place. So just before you transfer from this page, technological changes are needed to drive a period of economic progress. All of this made workers much more productive than they had been in the pre-industrial era, when production was slow and everything was handmade. Worker productivity goes up by a lot in the late 1800s. Second change is markets and demand. In the late 1800s, all the transportation and communication connections created bigger markets. So there was more opportunity to sell more and on a more widespread geographical basis. Even before that happened, though, the Civil War is actually a significant boost to industrialization. This is a photograph of a train car with, it's got a huge kind of cannon on it, artillery, and those big cannonballs, and they could move that along the rail lines. And that's something that took a fair amount of industrial advancement to build. And the Civil War, as we talked about in class, required industrial production from the North. So it is actually a huge spur or boost to the industrial age. And it's not an accident that our period of great industrialization follows the Civil War. Not like we want to have the war, but that is a positive outcome for the country. Post-Civil War, the fact that the country is more connected and there are more people in it means rising demand. And we're building the infrastructure. We're building the roads, the bridges, the buildings in the cities for a more modern society, and so that's increased demand. And then we actually, with better transportation, steamship transportation as opposed to sailing, we can have more exports to Latin America, Canada, Asia, which we had barely traded with before. Resources. When we talked about this in class, a few of the classes mentioned that you had to have resources. America is very rich in natural resources. We had coal, we had oil, and this is a picture of an iron mine up in Minnesota. The Mesabi iron deposits of Minnesota are some of the richest iron deposits in the world, and we had a lot of that. But I want to note something. Does a country really need vast natural resources to industrialize? Consider Britain, which was the first country to industrialize, and then Japan a little bit later. They're actually small island nations who were able to industrialize very well. They didn't have the resources, but they went and got them elsewhere. And so you don't actually have to have the resources. A lot of countries that are rich in resources don't ever industrialize because other countries take advantage and take them. So I put this one on here, but I don't, and I think it's useful, but I don't think it's absolutely one of the resources that are required or one of the factors. Labor. But you do have to have workers. Which does America have more of, land or people? Obviously it's land. So we needed lots of workers. We got them from two places. One was farmers who don't need to be farmers anymore. This is an era where it is actually tough to be a farmer, and a lot of people move from the countryside to the city to get jobs. And the other one, this is obvious from this photo, is huge, huge numbers of immigrants that pour in mostly from Europe, but from new countries in Europe than we'd had before. Let's talk about agriculture a little bit. This is a photo from the 1880s of Cyrus McCormick's reaper that not only cut the wheat and kind of gathered it up, but also would bind it with twine, all on that one machine. Agricultural productivity is critical to industrialization, and you should stop and think about why before you listen to my answer. And this is something that you talked about in Global as well with the British Industrial Revolution. I probably should have put this first. If you're going to have people building things and working in factories, then they don't have time to feed themselves or grow the food to feed themselves. So what agricultural productivity does is when you have a lot of agriculture being produced, a lot of goods, then that frees a chunk of the population to be able to live in cities, farm, and work in industry. And so there were huge advances in agricultural productivity in the 1800s, late 1800s, and part through mechanization, like this, the McCormick reaper, and also just through better use of land and seeds, and that boosted production immensely, and America became one of the great agricultural nations of the world in this time. Capital, we talked about this already. Let me just talk about what capital is. If you have money from a job, you can use it to pay rent or buy food, and those are operating expenses, and a business can have those same operating expenses. Buy raw materials, pay their workers. But capital is something different. That is money that you don't have to spend right away. You can spend it on things that are meant to last. So, a refrigerator is kind of a capital purchase, durable good. A car, a home. For a business, it takes investment capital to build a factory. We talked about how in the early 1800s, the industrialization led to fairly small mills. One family or a few partners could finance what it cost to build some of that with some loans. Steel mills, oil refineries, and railroads required millions of dollars in investment. They're massive installations, and it took new sources of money enabled to do that. And it was capital from the U.S., it was European investment money, and it couldn't be done just by loans, but it is the development of Wall Street and stocks and the stock market, which allows thousands of investors to pool their funds and buy small shares of stock in companies. So instead of getting capital from a bank or from one or two families, you're now getting it from thousands of investors. And the second piece of this that I didn't put on the slide, but you should know, is it's the separation of owners from managers. So in the old days, if you owned the company, you probably had a hand in running it. Now, the stockholders are different in some cases from all the people who actually run the company. And that is, in finance, a major shift and allows the development of the modern economy. Last slide, 15 minutes. Organization. This is a picture of Standard Oil's headquarters in downtown Manhattan, 31 stories tall. It is a huge building when it is first built, and it's kind of a visual representation of how these modern corporations of the late 1800s are much more complicated and much bigger than the businesses of the early 1800s. We talked about the pros and cons of Rockefeller and all those other guys, but one major thing that those guys were good at and contributed is they knew how to build large, efficiently run, complicated organizations. And I talked about this as well already. You began to see departments like shipping departments and purchasing departments, and you are organizing things in terms of having multiple locations that need to be able to communicate with each other. It was really actually a very complicated task, and despite all their kind of fraudulent ways, Crocker and Stanford and Gould even, and Rockefeller and Vanderbilt and Morgan were experts at efficiently organizing vast organizations. All right. Sorry for using that same word twice. I'm going to stop right here. I'll see you on Monday.